it's an honor for me to hold a meeting with these two gentlemen. I even wore a jacket. Is it okay now? Okay, so the questions will be put simultaneously to both gentlemen. I will not be asking, let's say, Jon Hare for 3 questions in a row, but I will be asking one and another. And I will start from Jon, because you started from you two as first.
I'm not sure. Me and Mike were talking about this yesterday. When did you start, Mike?
Well, when I started in the industry was about 1980 and just before. So when were you started, Jon?
Okay.
I started in 1985, so he might beat me to being first.
Okay, you are the first. I'm interested in your inspirations, because before computer games arrived, you cited in one interview, you said that your inspirations were you played Monopoly, Scrabble, Frustration Risk, and also Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson game books. Could you tell about these times when computer games didn't exist?
Thank you. Yeah, so in the times when we started making computer games, you know, there weren't a lot of computer games around, certainly home computers. There was only really the Atari VCS that most of us had in the 70s or 80s or played on, certainly from my perspective anyway. So I just started playing games. I played a lot of board games with my family. I played a lot of Sabutio with my dad, which was an inspiration for Sensible World of Soccer years later. I was really excited by the little team sheet with all the colours of the different teams, and this light blue and white team was Malmo in Sweden, but it was also Uruguay. I love this kind of stuff, and so yeah, I played a lot of those games. And actually, when myself and Chris started Sensible Software, we were originally playing in a band together. We were at school together, and we set up a band. So we were 3 years making music before games, and our inspiration for games was all the arcade machines at the time. So we were playing. I would play stuff like. Personally, I liked Asteroids and Centipede, and then Chris liked a lot of Nemesis and Salamander and those kind of games, and that was really our early inspiration.
It's actually quite strange that I didn't actually realise that Jon played a lot of board games, because the first game that I actually wrote was on the Spectrum and the C64 was actually Monopoly, and I did Scrabble and I did Cluedo. And I did quite a lot of board games. And I suppose my inspiration actually for doing more arcade games actually came from the arcades. I always remember I was a member of a squash club, and they brought in a Space Invaders machine. And I put 1 coin in and stayed on it all night long. And in the end, I had to take the machine out because they couldn't make any money. So, yeah, this inspiration was really from arcades.
Mm-hmm. And could you tell us about your first contact with arcades? Because, for example, for me, the first contact with Space Invaders wasn't a shock. It was too difficult for me, and I was only watching. And when you saw first arcade machine, let's say Pong or, I don't know, Asteroids or Centipede, you were astonished, you were shocked, or this was usual stuff for you?
Well, to be quite fair, I found Pong extremely boring because it was just a bat and a ball. But, you know, when when Space Invaders came along, and then Asteroids, and then Phoenix, and these were all, you know, relatively shoot-em-ups, so were quite good. And quite fun to play. And, you know, what makes a good arcade game is when you want to put more and more money in. Every time that you lose, you just want to put more money in and get to the end. And that makes a good game.
Okay. So
I've got to say that the first computer game I ever played was in 1974 when I was at school. I was 8 years old. And we had one of these school fates, you know, where you have little games like rolling a coin down to try and get it through a little doorway and throwing balls and stuff. And it was a Pong machine. So that's the first time I ever saw a computer game, when I was an 8-year-old kid. But when we were in England in the early 80s, a lot of arcades were there. And you'd have machines in a pub or in a chip shop or in a special arcade. So I used to play, when I went to school, I used to get the bus home, and there was a small arcade by the bus station. So sometimes I'd get a late bus home because I'd be playing in the arcades first, but I wasn't as good as Mike. I thought I was good, but I wasn't as good as Mike.
To be correct, your first arcade machine that you saw was Pong in 1975 in Junior School Bazaar.
Yes, correct. Absolutely.
So let's start about your professional careers. I will have a question to Jon. Your inspiration always, even in times when sensible software didn't exist, was to watch some other games and try to make them better. And I read in one of the interviews that you were playing Drop Zone, which was the clone of Defender. And then watching this, you started to create the idea to produce something better, and it was Parallax, some scrolling shooter. Could you tell about us?
I think that Drop Zone was more of an influence for Whizball than for Parallax because of the side scrolling. It started off in this way, but you know, me and Chris were a real creative partnership. We were writing music for years together, so when we transferred our focus from music to games, and we kept on making music for years, we were naturally a creative partnership. Anyone in the room who works in creative partnerships knows how this works. There's a kind of dynamic. It's a semi-conscious dynamic of working together. So when Chris, with Parallax, I don't know where that came from. I don't think it was Drop Zone. It was a different game. I can't remember which one, but it had been an arcade machine. But I'd come to Chris's house and he'd have some control system working a bit, and then I would do some art, and then we'd get the look of the game going, and then we'd work a little bit more on building up the story and the levels with Parallax and the scientist and all this kind of stuff. But all of the games were very, you know, they were iterated a lot. They were very much organically designed. In those days, we weren't working from design documents, and things like a decent control system, which was based on some arcade machine we'd seen normally, certainly in the early years, was how it all started, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And could you tell us about founding Sensible Software? It was how this process looked like. I mean, how it was in UK in the 90s.
Okay, so in the UK, certainly when I left college, which would have been in 1984, it was a time when there weren't that many jobs in the UK. So a lot of my friends, they left college and they had no job. And some of them still haven't got a job. But the route was often, if you couldn't get a job with another company, to work for yourself. So there's lots of small companies, and there's lots of encouragement to set your own companies up. At the time we started, I think not that dissimilar to when the Bitmap started. So myself and Chris got a job as a programmer in a local small company. Then I did some art for him, and they gave me a job. And then after 1 year, we decided, we made a game called Twister for System 3, quite an early Spectrum game. And we realized that actually the company we were working for were taking 85% of the money, and we were doing 100% of the work. So it didn't take us long to work out we were better off setting up our own company. At the time, there was in England a scheme from the government called the Government Enterprise Scheme. So for young people setting up a company, the government gave us £40 a week each. We needed some money in the bank, but we got the money by continuing to work. We pretended we were unemployed for a little while, and then we could set our company up. And this is how we set it up. In those days when there was, lots of small game companies springing up everywhere. And we had, at the time, quite a lot of good small publishers as well in the UK, which helped us.
Okay, Mike, you founded Bitmap Brothers in 1987. And I want to ask you about the process and about your logo, because Bitmap Brothers logo was very unusual. It was a hand, as if put as a form in some kind of mold. And I want to ask you about this, if inspiration for this was Mid-Your video clip, If I Was, because there was a very similar situation there.
Wow, that's going back a few years, 1987. We started the Bitmap Brothers. There was three of us. There was me, my ex-partner Steve and Eric, and we were actually all three of us working for another company doing Monopoly as a board game, and Scrabble, but working for different companies, we were in the same company. It was a bit strange. And then we had the idea of doing actually Xenon, and we went ahead and did Xenon, and then we said to ourselves, just before we actually finished Xenon, that we should really do this as a partnership and as a company, and that's when the company formed. The hand of the logo, where does the name Bitmap Brothers come from? Well, obviously everyone knows that a bitmap, well, you should know if you're here, that a bitmap is how you do the graphics in those days. So bitmap, we were very keen on doing, really good graphics. There was 3 of us, so that we weren't brothers, but we became brothers in arms, if you like. And therefore, the actual hand was a representation, once again, of a bitmap. And it's a strange logo because it's really, really hard to actually change. And to make that, nowadays you have these animated logos. We've never successfully made a decent animation of it. It's a bitmap.
I wanted to ask you about Xenon that you mentioned. It was the game that your company earned 25,000 pounds for this. It was your first money that you earned, and the press started describing you as rock stars because you were presenting. I was talking about this with John yesterday. You were like rock stars, leather dusters, dark glasses, and some kind of jewelry even. And could you tell us it was a very deliberate creation, or just you were wearing in that way in everyday life?
Okay, let's put it very, very, very simply. You don't go into a record shop and buy an Apple record. You go into a record shop and buy the Beatles. And that's how we saw the industry at the time, that it was the big publishers that had the names, like Ocean, or that's the only one, US Gold, and a few others. And they were the people that were promoted. And we said, when we did Xenon, we said, no, we're going to change this industry, and we're going to promote the artists, that is us, the people that produce it, so therefore, we went out and we hired our own photographers, we did our own PR, and because we did it, we knew what we wanted. We wanted to be rock stars in a way, but it was more to actually help the industry to evolve, to not rely on publishers, but to rely on individuals and groups of people. So it was actually worth it, and it worked, because we were one of the first group of programmers and artists that came together that were rock stars. And we produced all these really good, pictures with glasses and helicopters. It took a lot of effort, and that was our effort to do that. But it was great PR, because you send those really good pictures to the magazine and they printed it. And all of a sudden, we got the publishers getting very scared that their names were disappearing and ours was getting bigger. And so that's where it came from.
Okay, and John, you were described as one with your friends from Sensible Software as the guys from 60s British music, punk rock or something like that. And there were reports even that when you get frustrated, you smash all the furniture in your office.
Not the furniture, only the computers. The computers deserved smashing. Anyone who's worked with computers their whole life, there's plenty of reasons to want to smash them up. So whenever one was past its sell-by date, we never bypassed the opportunity to give it a good kicking, which was a lot of fun. So actually, this ties in with what Mike's saying. So Mike's right. To my knowledge, the Bitmaps were the first team that put their image out there. And there was a small period at Sensible when we'd had Whizball and Shoot 'em Up Construction Kit and the Microprose Soccer, and we'd had the #1 games. But somehow we saw the Bitmap Brothers were getting all this kind of attention from the photographs they were doing. And we had a small period of jealousy where they were called the Bitmap Wankers in our phone book that Chris wrote in. But we realised that what they were doing was a great way forward. And we actually almost copied this. With Megalomania, we started to do publicity. And the very first photo shoot we did, we made some T-shirts. and some caps with our names on. And we got all the old computers in the company. And by the time we got to Megalomania, we were in 1991. We'd had 4 or 5 years worth of useless machines, and we smashed them all up with rocks in a big place near the railway station where we lived in a photo shoot, which was an awful lot of fun because a lot of the cathode ray tubes exploded quite nicely for us with the rocks. So that was lots of fun, and we had lots of history of this. When we first got our office, we had an office about maybe half the size of this, and there was only 2 people in it, me and Chris. So we'd play. I don't know if you guys know cricket. It's a sport we play that a lot of people find very boring, but it was fun in our office. So we rolled up a ball of tape, and we used an Amstrad as a bat, and a box as the wicket, and one of us would bowl the ball at the other one would hit the Amstrad on the ball as hard as we could, and try and get runs. And if we managed to get one of the keys to fall off the Amstrad, we got 4 runs as a bonus. So yeah, we got a lot of destruction. And we used to play, when we made Sensible Soccer, the old Conix joysticks, you know, the black and red stripy ones, the little round ones you hold like this. We had a lot of those in our office, and often they would just stop working. And we used to play conkers with them, so just like this, just to smash them onto each other. So Chris Chapman, our lead programmer of Sensible Soccer and Megalomania, he was the Conkers champion in the office. So yeah, we've got a lot of history of destruction. And the band you're talking about was the Kinks. The 60s band is the Kinks, who had a reputation for smashing up their equipment, I think. And I think when we did the Sensible Software book, we were looking at bands to compare software makers to, and our comparison would be the Kinks, because we're British, we're quite old and formative, we were successful, but we were still a bit quirky. So this is why that analogy was used.
Before we start talking about specific game titles, I want to ask you about, Mike, about the key figure in the island during late 80s and early 90s. It was Robert Maxwell and his Mirrorsoft. You were connected with him because you published the first games by Mirrorsoft, as far as I know. And he died mysteriously in 1991. Could you tell us about your history with Robert Maxwell? Did you meet him personally or not?
Oh dear. Good job he's not here. Robert Maxwell was obviously a very big person in the media industry in England. We borrowed his helicopter for the pictures, and I actually read I've read in the magazine that that's at the show here. The story's not quite true. We didn't hire the helicopter for 20 minutes. We waited all day for him to come back from the horse racing, so we could have 10 minutes before they put all the ropes on the helicopter and all the covers and everything. And it just turned out that it was a blessing in disguise, because it was sunset at that time, so we got these really, really gorgeous pictures. And that was down to Maxwell. The other problem, of course, with, Maxwell committed suicide. Well, did he? No one actually knows. No one actually knows if he's actually dead. But he left a big hole in the Mirror Group, stole all the pensions and all sorts of things, and we lost an awful lot of money because we had just had People 2 was just out at that time and was selling massively, and we didn't receive hardly any royalties from it. So it was a bit of a downer. So it's a good job he's not here, because I might just punch him in the face if I saw him.
Okay, I see. About Sensible Software and Robert Maxwell, we will talk in a few minutes. Now I have questions. We will go to the games.
Well, I've got something to talk about with that, because this situation of Mirrorsoft and Robert Maxwell jumping off his boat was very crucial in the British games industry, because we had just signed, we had Megalomania with Mirrorsoft, and we had just signed a 4-game deal about 3 months before this happened. So we signed Sensible Soccer, Cannon Fodder, Megalomania 2, and Megalomania on Mega Drive, I think, at the time. And actually, for us, we lost, like Mike, we lost a ton of money on Megalomania, because the game went to #1, but we never got any royalties from it because before the first quarter's royalty check came in, Robert Maxwell jumped off his boat. And actually, there was us, and there was about 4 or 5 of the biggest development companies in the UK who were all signed with Microsoft. They were the biggest company at that time. And we all had to take our own business separate ways. So we had, Mike had his solution, we found our solution. What other companies were signed? What was Fergus's company? I mean, there's quite a few other big development companies signed up that all had to find their own routes. So actually, the history of the Amiga part of the games industry would have been very different if Microsoft hadn't have collapsed. They would have been the most powerful publisher. So just at that point they collapsed. They were about to become the most powerful games publisher in Europe, probably, judged by who they had signed up.
Okay, I see. I will ask you about Megalomania, of course, but now we are in 1988, and you produced the demo of football game, and you call it Sensible Soccer, and you went with it to Microprose. Microprose, as far as I know, offered you £30,000, but insisted on changing the name of the game, and they changed it to Microprose Soccer. Could you tell us about your first football game?
Yeah, when we made Microprose Soccer, we'd been playing a lot of an arcade machine. Like a lot of our early games on the Commodore 64, we were heavily influenced by arcade machines, and we'd been playing a game called Take On World Cup, which was one of the best football games in the arcades at the time. It was on a table with a trackball. I don't know if anyone remembers this game. And Microprose Soccer was very much based on this. We added some rain and the ball bending and stuff like this. And it was a pretty good game when it came out. CMVG called it the best sports game on any platform of all time, which is quite nice for us. And we got a very big review. We would have preferred to call it Sensible Soccer, but Microprose did offer us rather a nice sum of money at the time, so we took that instead. I've got to say, they were not a nice company to work for. Probably of all the publishers we worked for, they were the ones we enjoyed working with least. I think I can say that now, because some of the management were very, very nice, and some of the management were really not at all nice. So, but yeah, the game came out and it did okay. And it was, I think it's the only game we put out through a US-based publisher, probably until we get to Warner a long time later. So we worked in the UK office of Microprose, which was an American company.
Okay. You, Mike, you were going in some kind parallelly with Jon, because they produced Microprose Soccer and you produced Speedball. And then there was Speedball 2, Brutal Deluxe, which sold 2 million copies. It was phenomenal success. I want you to tell us about this game, and do you confirm that the inspiration for this game was taken from the movie Rollerball with James Caan, because it was a very popular movie in the 70s. Did you watch
Rollerball? I've never seen it. Is it a film? Yes, I mean, Speedball and Speedball 2 was actually, particularly Speedball 2, the press did say, oh, this is very much like Rollerball. I can assure you, actually, we didn't actually see Rollerball, the film, until the press said that this is a really good film and it's like Speedball, so we started to watch it. So did it influence the game? Not at all. Did it influence bits of the game after we watched the film? Well, I'll leave that to your imagination, really. But Speedball was different to football. We wanted to do a game that was that really had no rules. You know, football's got rules. Speedball really doesn't have any rules. It's all about actually winning. You know, the other thing that people say about Speedball, that it's really violent. It's not violent at all, really. It's up to how the player thinks that it's violent, so therefore the violence comes from actually playing it. So, yeah. Rollerball, no, not at all.
Okay, and this is a very important question to Jon. Your landmark game, in my opinion, of course, was Megalomania. it was created during this Robert Maxwell problems, because it was when he died and there was problem with distribution. But from historical perspective, it was probably one of the most important games of the 90s, because was also it also defined your future games, because it had 3 elements that were common in your future games. It was small characters, very frenetic, quick action, and the third one, kind of a gaming that could be called light strategy. Could you tell us about this game and about the consequences of publishing this game, about Megalomania 2 also that was cancelled?
Okay, yeah, so Megalomania was a landmark game for us. The game before Megalomania was International 3D Tennis. I don't know if any of you guys have seen this. It's probably one of our more obscure games. It didn't look that great, but it was the game that we started to put proper bigger worlds into stuff. So behind the funny little line-drawn 3D players, there was an entire realistic tennis season world with all the different players, all the tournaments, all the prize money. And we started to look at making bigger games with a little bit more size and scope. Probably from Micro Bros Soccer it was the first time we used a game with a tournament based with teams, and we started to extend this thing very much into lots of our sports games. So 3D Tennis was the first game we worked on the Amiga. We originated it on the Commodore 64, and then we did a conversion to the Amiga with a guy called Dave Korn. And actually that was the first time we'd had a game with a programmer that wasn't Chris. So Chris Yates has done all the programming up to that Amiga conversion of 3D Tennis. So as 3D Tennis was being finished, we started originating our first game on the Amiga, the first one which started in the Amiga, which was Megalomania. And Megalomania was done by a guy called Chris Chapman. We advertised for a programmer. We found one locally to us in Cambridge, in England. And Chris also ended up being the programmer on Sensible Soccer. So Chris Yates and Chris Chapman and Jules Jameson, who did Cannon Fodder, were our 3 main programmers in most of Sensible. And Dave Korn did bits and bobs as well. And then we had a lot of people at the end. But our famous games, Megalomania was mostly myself working with Chris Chapman. So Chris Chapman did the programming, and the main bulk of the art and the design was done by me. And because we had more size to experiment, we could experiment a bit more with the design. So we were just looking at the idea of having minerals that you mine. And initially, Megalomania was set in space. It was a space race game where you just go and increase your technology. So if you haven't played the game, you go to a piece of land. The land's divided into sectors. Each sector of land you can take over and build a castle or a point that you own. And in the land, there's minerals. You mine the minerals. You then set up a design laboratory, and you can start to design new weapons and new defense weapons. And with these weapons you design, you advance your technology. So initially, it was just a space race, starting in 4000 AD and going forwards. We then, but 6 months before the game came out, Populous came out. And this was the first time we'd seen Populous. And what we borrowed from Populous was the caveman. We saw the little screenshot of a caveman. This is about all it was. And we thought, isn't our history of technology going to be better if we start it in 4000 BC instead of 4000 AD, start with cavemen and then go up through biblical times into the First World War. And
then the game was called My Little Warhead, as far as I know.
Yes, so exactly. So when we made that connection with adding that, we started to call the game internally My Little Warhead. So if you know My Little Pony, we had a big nuclear missile warhead with a big pink fluffy wig on it. And this was our logo for quite a while internally before we called it Megalomania. But we didn't realize at the time, but you know, Megalomania is the first ever game to have a tech tree in it. So we were used to tech trees in games now. We actually were the first game to do that. There's a game called Herzog's Fate. It's a German game, which we were not aware of them. I'm sure they weren't aware of us. But they also did some stuff to do with mining, but I don't think they did the tech tree. So yes, as it turned out, it was a formative game. It was interesting that we obviously weren't aware of Populous for the first year of making our game. Populous, but Peter Molyneux wouldn't have been aware of us. but we were both working on different types of God games at the same time. And in those days, there was so much experimentation going on. And I'm really happy that you point out that Megalomania is a landmark game, because to us it was. And this business about Robert Maxwell jumping off a boat was very serious for Megalomania. If that hadn't have happened, I think Megalomania would have been a much bigger success than it was, not only in Europe, but maybe even in the States. But yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, it preceded Civilization and Dune 2. It was the first in the kind.
Yeah, well, we may get onto this later, but there's quite a lot of separation of now the internet is driving our memories of the software industry, and the internet is was for years predominantly an American domain, and we started to add stuff from Europe over time. But a lot of the history of games, if you read it on the internet, and a lot of channels, is very skewed towards an American perspective, which is very PC and Nintendo-based software during that time. And so we did have problems at the time, not just with Megalomania, but also after Mirrorsoft fell apart, a lot of the Mirrorsoft people went across to work with Virgin, who we obviously did Cannon Fodder with, which we'll come into later. But we did have a problem with getting our games made in Europe, given the same amount of attention as the games being made in America. And they are things like Civilization, like Dune 2, like Command and Conquer. All three of those games, they could have equally focused on things like Megalomania and Cannon Fodder and pushed those instead. But that, for whatever reason, that didn't happen.
I want to ask Mike about this transition period. The good old days of 8-bit were gone, and you started producing games for Amiga and ST only. Your first such game, as far as I know, was Xenon 2, I think, Mega Blast. It was your first game exclusive for 16-bit computers. And then you started the whole line of Amiga, very classic Amiga titles. And I want to ask you about Cadaver. It was probably one of your greatest hits of the early 90s. Could you tell us about this game?
Actually, all our games were on the 16-bit. We started with Xenon, which was the first one, and Speedball 2, which were both came out on the ST and the Amiga. The 8-bit versions were actually ports afterwards. Yeah, so we went from Speedball, the first game. The second game was the first game was Xenon. Actually, does anyone remember
Xenon 2 was
with
exclusive.
Xenon that it was actually called Kelly X? Yeah, does anyone here know that it was called Kelly X?
Mega Blast.
No, it's called Kelly X, and the reason I say that is because that was the pirate version. Which actually sold, which didn't sell, but actually had more copies out there than actually with Xenon. So there was Xenon, Speedball, Xenon 2, Speedball 2, and then Cadaver was actually started before Speedball 2, but it was a much larger project. I think it took something like 2.5 years. This is where, at the point that the Bitmap Brothers changed direction slightly, where we started to do more than one game at a time. So Cadaver was actually behind the scenes, if you like, and until Speedball 2 was out. Cadaver was an isometric adventure game. For us, it was a completely different departure because it wasn't really an arcade game at all. But we still used the graphic. Still made sure that the graphics were as bright and had the same sort of style, and it was quite. In some respects, it was our first attempt at a 3D game, even though it was in 2D isometric. Everything actually within the world was actually 3D, and yeah, it was. It was a strange game because it was trying to get into the American market as an adventure game, because at the time there was quite a lot of adventure games out there. Larry, what was it? Larry can't pronounce that, and a few of those others. But the problem is we also put a little bit of humour into it, a little bit, and the Americans didn't get it, and it was too hard for them, which was a shame. And of course, then from Canada, we just went on to do some platform arcade type games, and then on to RTSs.
John, Sensible Soccer. You publish it with Renegade software. You got 90,000 pounds in cash, and royalties were divided 50-50, which was very, very propitious for you. Tell us about this game, about this craze producing it, because you were obliged to meet the deadlines of Euro 1992, and also such question that it was similar to Micro Soccer. What were the difference between these two games?
Okay, so this is kind of tying everything together a bit more. So, for a start, when we were making Megalomania, myself and Chris Chapman, we worked a lot of very late nights. I don't know if everyone knows Megalomania, the music when you load up, there's this kind of music. And we'd listen sometimes to 3 or 4 versions of this all around the office, which is fairly trippy, actually. And when we were working these late nights, we were often compiling the game, and we were playing a lot of Kickoff and Kickoff 2, which we enjoyed, but which we felt was had some annoying things in it, like you couldn't see the people you were passing to, and we swore at the game a lot as well, and eventually we threw it on the train track outside the office window when we got fed up with it one day. Anyway, when we started to make Sensible Soccer, we firstly had a little man in a football kit standing in the Megalomania world, running around. This is the very first thing. And quickly we used that perspective, made a football pitch, and we realised it was a very good game. And as I said before, we signed it to Mirrorsoft. When Mirrorsoft went down, we then got our games back from Mirrorsoft. So we got Sensible Soccer, and we got Cannon Fodder, and we got Megalomania 2 back. Megalomania on the Mega Drive we signed to Ubisoft. Cannon Fodder we signed to Virgin, which was pushing forward, and we'd already seen them with Megalomania initially, and they didn't sign it, but they took a few more key staff, people like Sean Brennan, who was probably key in both of our titles as a marketing guy, went across to Virgin, and we signed with them. And actually, Mike and the Bitmap Brothers set up a new publisher called Renegade, which you should probably talk to Mike about before we talk about Sensible Soccer. But in the end, we signed up Sensible Soccer with Mike's company, so that 90,000 advance we got was actually from him.
Yeah, they were fun times, actually. I can remember playing golf with John. And at the end of the golf match, after I think it was 18 holes, and John's so competitive, we let him win most of the time, and we let him win that day. And then I signed the contract on the boot of the car, didn't we, as we were actually leaving, because Renegade was a departure for the industry, very similar to how we were setting up Pop Stars with ourselves. That we wanted to actually do this with other companies as well, and we felt that the other publishers were still around, weren't given enough effort, PR effort, and marketing into the actual into the groups again. And just promoting themselves. So part of Renegade was to get in as many as the UK developers as we could to start promoting them as well. And then we also thought at the time is that these big publishers were making so much money, where all the little developers weren't making any money at all. So we split the revenue rather on a much better, a fairer system. The only problem is that worked really well for Sensible Soccer. It worked well for Bitmap Brothers titles. There was Graph Gold that was involved as well. We did well with them. But the problem is with we couldn't quite compete with money because the market was changing from, years ago. I mean, Xenon, it cost us £25,000 to actually make, when it actually cost us less than that. That's the advance that we got, was 25,000. But by the time we were getting to sort of Century Soccer days and Z days, we're starting to look at budgets of like, the budget for Z was like nearly £2 million, and that was coming virtually out of our own pockets, and it was inexpensive. But the problem is, then the market was going from not £2 million budgets to £10 million budgets, and like nowadays, there's a lot of games out there where the budgets are just humongous, incredibly high. But also, there's a lot of independent developers out there who can write really good games a lot cheaper as well, and probably beat some of the big guys.
I will ask you about Z, but before that I want to ask you about Gods. For me it was a smash hit. Could you tell us how this game was produced and who was responsible for it?
Gods was, oh blimey, got to think about this one. That's going back a bit. Yeah. Gods was came from my my ex-partner Eric. Do you know what? I don't know what inspired us to do that game. All I know is that when we actually did it, that it was one of the most enjoyable games that we actually did and played within the company. And it was virtually, if I remember right, it was to do with, this person was going to be a god in sort of like in the Roman Greek mythology times, so that all the big bad bosses were some of the gods that were around at the time, in mythology. Sorry. That's as much as I can tell you on that one. I'm a bit vague. I'm sorry.
Okay, so now the question to Jon. The question will be very, very short. Tell us about Canon Fodder and the craze that was created by it in UK, because there was a whole campaign against you after you published it.
You mean from the British Legion? Okay. Yeah, so I guess most of you guys know Canon Fodder. It's one of, along with Sensible Soccer, one of our two most famous games. So with Canon Fodder, we had the game running. So you start off with the game and a control system of people running around, a little group of soldiers. I think we're the first people to use a little group of soldiers. So we had a little group of soldiers running around, and then they get to the end of the mission, and you're like, okay, so what happens when they finish? So we decided it would be a nice idea to kind of use a military theme and to rank them up, like from corporal to sergeant or wherever the rankings are, which is what we did. And then we showed, at the end of the game, we started to have a little bit of each level which showed how they ranked up. Now, at the same time, as you know, there's a long stream of guys queuing up to go to war. All the civilians waiting to get the uniform. And they've got this big hill behind them, which for a long while was just a big empty hill doing absolutely nothing. And this big queue of people. So as they're going through, we decided, well, why don't we give all these guys names? So we called them our names, like Jops, which is me, Jules, who is Jules Jamieson, the lead programmer, Stu, who's Stu Cambridge, who was the lead artist on Canon Fodder, because that's the first game that I didn't do the art for. And then the rest of the team, Chris and RJ, who did our music and all this kind of stuff. And then loads of made-up names, loads and loads, 500 stupid names at the end. And so, of course, all these guys pile through, and you see them ranking up. But then we thought, okay, well, at the end of each level, why don't we also just put up the names of the guys who've died? Just as an experiment. We did it, actually, in the office. And then we were looking at this, and we're like, fuck, look at all these dead people, It was actually really surprising. We didn't know how many people were dying, And the game was called Lemmings with Weapons internally, a bit like My Little Warhead. And this idea for Canon Fodder as a name came from all these dead people that you didn't notice, Because we always had the home and away score for who's living and who's dying. But when we put the names up and we saw the dead people, And then we added the sad music, and I'll be playing some music later on if anyone wants to listen to it. It's going to be a big experiment, but I will play that song and sing it because it originally was done with words. So I had this sad love song from when I was a teenager, and myself and Richard Joseph just took the song, took the words out, changed it to an instrumental song, which is the song you hear when, we got the list of everyone that's died. And then as a finishing touch, we added gravestones on the hills for each dead person. And of course, because they're all different ranks, we gave the guys with the bigger officer rank a bigger gravestone, and the guys, like the nobody guys, tiny little gravestones. So what the feeling of this was we had a game which properly reflected on people dying in war. So we thought it was appropriate to put a poppy. I don't know, in Poland, if you have these plastic red poppies every November for remembering people who died in the war. So on the original box art, it was a black box with a red poppy with cannon fodder in it. That's all it had. And we were displaying this art. And before we put the game out, the Royal British Legion, who's the organisation in the UK that does the celebrations in November to remember all the war dead from the 2 world wars every year, they wrote to us and they said to us, it was scandalous that we were putting their poppy on something as crass as a computer game, and what the hell do you young boys think you're doing, disrespecting the war dead? And we said to them, look, have you played our game? This game actually does give some kind of respect to people who die in war. But they weren't listening to us. And then they said, well, anyway, this poppy that you've put on the box, it's our copyright. We own that copyright of that poppy. And they actually asked for some money because we'd infringed their copyright. So we paid them £500 and under our breath told them to fuck off. And I've never bought a poppy since, I've got to say. I used to buy them every year. I've never bought one since. I bought 250 poppies back in 1993. And I always used to pay £1, so I'm not going to do that anymore. But that's why you get the message at the start of Cannon Fodder, which says this game is not in any way endorsed by the Royal British Legion. They actually requested us to put that in the game to distance themselves from the game. As it happened, it was a brilliant little selling point in the game, but it actually came from them. So that's the story of that. And actually, was it a national newspaper, one of the cheaper national newspapers, picked this up and ran the story in the newspaper, which is why people remember it so well.
Mike, let's talk about Z. You mentioned about this game earlier. You mentioned that the budget it had was £3 million. It was RTS strategy that was meant to be conquering with Command & Conquer and Westwood Studios. How this game fare and what was the story about this? It was a success, it was a failure, or what?
Z was originally written on the Amiga. I can't remember the year. I know it took us nearly 4.5 years to actually make, maybe even 5. And it was just supposed to be, it was supposed to be a funny game, just an RTS. I suppose, did Cannon Fodder actually inspiration? Yeah, it probably did a little bit actually, because it was supposed to be sort of like that. And then as the weeks went on and we were actually developing the game, that we realised that the Amiga was dying. It was dead. There was no point in doing Amiga games. There was no money to be made. It was a real shame because we had working versions on it. So then we switched to the PC. And then, there was a funny thing then, because the PC games were all on floppy disks. And then all of a sudden, the CD came in. What's a CD? Well, the CD has 680 megabytes of space, and the publisher says you have to fill it. And we said, but the game only fits on one floppy drive. So that's where all the videos and all the FMVs came in. We hired a professional script writers from a film company to do all the scripts. We wanted all the humour of the robots, of the General Zod, and I can't remember. the two guys, I can't remember the names of the one in the deck chairs. Anyway, and so we spent the next. We probably finished the game. We would have finished the game in about 18 months, and it took 4.5 years. It took us nearly 3 years to do the FMVs to fill up that the CD drive. Luckily, the DVD didn't come out in the meantime because that would have been even more of a nightmare. And then we finished the game. Was it a success? It was a success. It was one of our biggest selling games. It sold if I remember, 375,000 units in England on its first day. It did extremely well in Europe. In Russia, it actually went into millions what it was sold, but it was a much smaller price. The only market that it didn't sell was America. The reason why it didn't sell in America, it was a little bit too hard for Americans. They tend to like games that are simple to play rather than complex, sadly. And also, of course, it came out with Virgin, and it was competing with one of their top products as well, Command and Conquer. So the marketing money they put in America was virtually nothing. But in Europe, it stormed.
Okay, let's continue the topic that Mike started. We were talking about this yesterday when wandering the old city. You had phenomenal success with Canon Fodder and Sensible Soccer in Europe, but you didn't manage to get through to United States. And the main culprit of this situation, you named Westwood Studios, and you called them very
it's quite interesting to hear Mike's side of it, because it's kind of adding up to what was really going on. It confirms what we were talking about yesterday. So, you know, we understood why Sensible Soccer sold extremely well across Europe. I think that the thing with Sensible Soccer and with SWOS, because we included every country in the world, like, for example, in Poland, we put the Polish League, we put all the Polish teams. I'm sure not many of you guys actually bought the game, but I'm sure a lot of you played it. And you'll have found that you had your own teams in the game, which there weren't a lot of other football games supporting Polish teams at the time. And this was replicated all over the world, so in Argentina, in South Africa, in old Yugoslavia, in everywhere. People really responded, and, you know, to this day we even still have a tournament now about this. But we understood why Sensible Soccer wouldn't sell in America, because it's a soccer game, a football game, and they've got another game called football, which, quite frankly, looks like rugby to us. But we understood why it wouldn't sell. Megalomania, I didn't understand why that didn't sell, but we kind of excused that because of the timing of Microsoft collapsing, that maybe we'd have got a push, it didn't happen. But when it came to Cannon Fodder, we were starting to get pissed off, because we had a great game. There's no reason why that game shouldn't sell in America as well as in Europe, because it sold very well all across Europe again. It's not that complicated to play. And we started to see the politics emerging between America and Europe. So at the time, Virgin US was quite dominant in terms of game making, which is where Westwood Studios were signed, who were making Command & Conquer. And did they previously do Dune? Was it the same company? They did Dune previously, yeah. So they'd done Dune, then they were doing Command & Conquer. Then we come out with Cannon Fodder, kind of in the middle of this, yeah? At the same time, Mike's making Z. So you can see all these things are all happening at the same time. But to give you an idea of how much they were biased towards the American side from the European side, when we went out to America to do a tour of Cannon Fodder, to show all the different, to show the US office, to show the press and stuff there, Virgin US were more interested in showing us their great studio, Westwood Studios, and what they've got internally. And look at this great thing they're doing, which turned out to be Command & Conquer. So the writing was already on the wall. Europe was actually propping up the US side financially, but the US side were very focused on their own developments. And at this time, we started to pick up the trend that happened going into the 90s a lot, as you get to 95, 96, 97, 98, that the power of European developers, even then you could tell it was starting to become less powerful. You know, it was very noticeable when we got into the full console era, but it was starting to move even then. And to this day, I'm really pissed off about it. If there's one company that I feel got a leg up over us, it was Westwood Studios. And I didn't know there was the same with Mike as well. But I'm sure it's exactly the same story.
Actually, I want to say a little bit more on this. Because not only we believe that in America that Virgin purposely didn't market our product. Westwood Studios actually took our lead programmer from Z, and a lot of the stuff that was in Command and Conquer is actually Bitmap Brothers stuff that he took with him, and that we actually felt that was done on purpose as well. They approached him probably about a year before we were finished. And offered him so much money that he just couldn't refuse to go there. And it is so sad, really, because, you know, when Command and Conquer came out, there was so much of Z actually in it, but there was nothing we could do about it at the time. It's crazy.
I think what we're talking about here is the start of a new genre of game, which is RTS games, right? Because there weren't many RTS games before this point. And the point is, you hear people think that these are the early RTS games. But we made them here, you know. We made Cannon Fodder, got it out before that game. Mike was busy making Z, maybe before or as Command and Conquer was being made. Yet if you read on a lot of websites, you won't see this acknowledged anywhere. This is a problem. It's about documenting history properly and giving credit where credit's due. It would just be nice to see that acknowledged by some people, other than us just whinging about it, which gets a bit dull.
To consolate you, I can tell that two founders of Westwood Studios are out of the business. Louis Castle is doing nothing, and Brett Sperry runs Gallery. You are still in a business, so it's a consolation for you.
Well, I mean, you know, we've had loads of hit games. You know, we are probably the two most successful studios from that whole era of Commodore 64 and Amiga, going on the PC a little bit in those early days. So we've got nothing to worry about. We've had our days in the sun. We've had a lot. It's more about the historical context of how games were formulated when people talk about different genres of game. As I said, it's due to the fact that the Amiga and the Commodore 64 never did anything in North America at all. Those two formats almost didn't exist there commercially. That's really the issue here. That's why if you look at companies like Bullfrog, who are very much like peers of ours, Peter and Les were very smart about focusing on the PC quite early. So when that transition to American Power went, they were already on the PC, which was a format which was big in the States compared to the Amiga. I mean, Peter will tell you that now if you ask him. Likewise, companies like Rare, who focused on Nintendo, again, they were in a good place because it's the right format. But we jumped ship of the Amiga too late, probably commercially in that sense, which is also part of it, I think.
I totally agree with John says.
Let's talk about more modern times. You, Mike, closed all the Bitmap Brothers in 2004, and then started to produce the games for the remakes of the old Amiga games for iOS, and you refused to produce the games for Android because, as you said, the problem with Android is that everybody wants games for nothing and they don't want to pay anything. Could you tell us about this modern times and how you find in this reality?
Did I really say that? Well, it's true. It's the mobile market, as a smartphone market as we see it now, is becoming free to play. I actually don't believe in free to play. I think that a lot of developers spend a lot of money and get nothing because it's just like spaghetti. Throw it against the wall, it's the game that sticks that will make the money. And there's a lot of good games out there to do that. I think the market's becoming very flooded. I think, you know, particularly with the Android, it is so easy to pirate it. I didn't believe how easy it was until somebody sent me an image and I put it onto my phone and it just worked. And I thought, this is crazy. This is totally crazy. You know, if people don't pay for games, developers won't make money. If they don't make money, there won't be developers, you know, because people have to eat, people have to live. So therefore, you know, this free for play, I think it's a load of crap. Personally, I think the game should have a small amount of money that everyone pays for. And in fact, in some respects, if we're going to do free for play, let's change the market. Not oh, let's take out the advertising. Not oh, you get something better if you pay more money. Let's actually put something in a game that says, if you've enjoyed this game, send us some money so we can make the next one. Sorry, my pet subject. I could go on for hours.
Actually, I've had a thought about this, because some people say free-to-play is just a different market. You've got to go into it. It's really good. There's some great games. I've got a question for the whole audience. Does anyone think any of our old games would have been better if you had something popping up every 5 minutes asking you for money? Anyone? Hands up. There you go. See, free-to-play is something we have to tolerate, which is a pretty shit business model, because no one sells anything for free. I don't buy a car for free. I don't get a sandwich for free. You know? You can't get anything for free. So I think there's proof that, you know, when you make a free-to-play game, it really restricts what you can do in game design as well. There's so many things you can't do because you've got to constantly think about getting money. Free-to-play games are made to appeal to the 3% of people who are likely to pay the money, which means that 97% of people are getting a worse experience than they would have had without all the free-to-play stuff in it. That is actually the reality. And I think that people who... It's quite complex, because people think when old guys like us whinge about it being better in the old days, that we're saying that no one's good enough making games anymore, which is not what we're saying. As Mike said, there's loads of brilliant games. The problem with the current market is it's not good for good young developers like we were to be found and to be supported and to emerge, you know? You know, we used to have publishers backing us, giving us money, enabling us to build a career and supporting us. Nowadays, you've got... I'll give you an example of the numbers. In 1992, when Sensible Soccer was released, there were 1,000 games released on the Amiga in that year, 1992. There's now 1,000 apps released every day on the iPhone, okay? So the chance of being discovered is so much less. Now, within those 1,000 apps a day, there's probably going to be 10, 15, 20, maybe even 50, probably about 20 really good apps that you can't discover, and that's the key problem. Or maybe one. Even if it's one, it doesn't matter. These games aren't getting discovered. And what we need to do, I think, in our industry is to be more discriminatory about who we support. Like, would you go to an art gallery where you've got all your kids' pictures that they did in primary school stuck on the wall? Look what my son can do. Look what my daughter can do. This is the App Store. People who aren't experienced in making games copying other people. That's 90% of what we're seeing on there. This is not professional work. It shouldn't be considered professional work. And what it's doing is it's stopping the professionals coming through. But more importantly than us established professionals, we don't need it. For us, it's annoying, but we don't need it. But there's some young guys there that are brilliant, and their work is being drowned by these crappy things which are like little kids' scribbles. So this is the bigger artistic issue to address, in my opinion, apart from the fact the financial model is totally useless.
Okay, our time is closing. So I have a last question to you, Jon. When we were talking yesterday, I asked you, have you ever been to Poland? And you said, yeah, well, 50 times or so. Yes. You were going every time to Bydgoszcz. Could you tell us what you were doing there?
Yeah, so for the last 4 years, I've been working with Vivid Games, who are based in Bydgoszcz. When I started working with them, they're pretty small. They had about 13 people. They were working in an apartment, which had kind of been converted into an office. And they were making a lot of mobile games, lots of handsets and stuff. But Vivid is slowly emerging into one of the better Polish teams on touch screens now, touch phones. They did Real Boxing last year. They've got a really good game called Godfire coming out later this year, which looks amazing, actually, The Rise of Prometheus. And they've also worked with me and Mike. So they did Speedball, we put out in 1991, 2011, sorry, let's jump forward 20 years. 2011 on iOS. We've also done it on Symbian, on Android, on PS Plus, a recent version on Steam, and also my original game, World Explorer, which is my first original game in 20 years, came out last month on the iOS, and is about to come out on PC and Mac as well. And again, that's with Vivid Games. So yeah, I've been coming to Poland since 2009, 1 week a month. So my Polish is shockingly bad. I'm really, really sorry. I didn't learn enough. I can say a few poor swear words that we all learn, but there you go. That's about it. But yes, I mean, I've been working in this country a long time, and I've got a good feeling for the passion for games in this country, for the passion for the retro market, and this country's up-and-coming country in games. You get that feeling that there's the desire to make things happen. And this is why this stuff we're talking about, the good teams emerging and being given a chance, is very important for countries like Poland, where there are talented people and where you will start to get younger people who can just break away and do their own thing. The hardware's there. They need the business to support it. And indeed, you know, the publishing companies we had, even companies like Renegade that Mike ran, would be looking for teams like that. This is what I would like us to get back to. So I think this country's got a very bright future in games, I think, over the next 5 or 10 years.
Okay, thank you very much for our discussion, and have a nice day at Pixel Heaven till the end of the day. Thank you.